And welcome back everyone to part 2 of the full 1d4 repertoire from the white side. And in this video we're going to have a look at systems where black goes for d5 and e6 setups most likely, or also for Slav setups with not bishop to f4 but bishop to f5 or bishop to g4. In the first part, if you haven't seen that yet, definitely check it out first. In the first part we looked at systems where black fianchettos the bishop to the king side. And as I said, now we're going to have a look at systems with d5 and e6 in most cases. So if you've seen the first part, you already realize that this repertoire is kind of easy for white. At least this is kind of the whole idea of it, that I'm trying to give you some easy to play ideas, which are not that theoretical. And I try to keep the same style for this part as well. And after d5, what I would recommend you here is this move e3, which I also recommended to a number of my students, and they had pretty good results with the resulting positions here. So what I want to go for in some cases is the Zuckertorch system with b3, bishop b2, bishop d3, and short castle. But to understand that, it's first important to discuss that it's not possible against all black setups, because this setup with bishop d3, b3 only works if black boxes in his own bishop on c8 as well. If black chooses other move orders, which we're gonna get into, it will be harder to get the setup with b3 and bishop d3. The perfect example is this move order with c5. So let's have a look at this first. Now, if we were to go for the same with bishop d3, knight c6, and for example b3 now the main difference is that black hasn't played e6 yet and can play something like bishop g4 when his bishop is basically just happy. He stepped in front of the pawn chain, will play e6 next, and black has a very comfortable position here. So after c5, we cannot go for this. And my recommendation here is to go d takes c5, which is still somewhat of a rare line. There have been a number of top-level games here, but I still think it will be coming as a surprise to most players, and it's quite a tricky system to handle with black if he's not familiar with that. In case you're not comfortable going in some more complicated positions here, I would recommend you to look into bishop e2, which has some sort of a Kolev there in some cases. After bishop e2, knight c6, now the idea is to go c3, at least one of the ideas. Also short castle, for example, is possible, but after bishop g4, black is equalizing. And this system with c3 has been played by Vincent Keimer, among others, but he in particular had pretty good results here. And the point is simply white wants to get some sort of semi-Slav or Slav position with a tempo up, basically. So one example line would go e6, short castle, and whenever black moves the bishop, for example, bishop d6, then white wants to take, because now he has to use one more tempo to regain the pawn on c5. And now this typical plan from the Moran, b4 followed by knight d2, and white will try to free his position with c4 later on, mostly in connection with b5 and then c4. Sometimes white can also go a3 and then to prepare c4 with a playable position overall. If black doesn't move the bishop just yet, for example, I think even Anish Giri played a move like h6 here, then it's important not to take, because now black would have this extra move h6, as the same applies to queen c7 here, basically. So Vincent, in some cases, even went for waiting moves like a3, which can be very useful later on. So it would make sense, for example, to start with knight d2 as well, and then just wait for him to move the bishop, basically, and then only to take on c5. So this system is also quite interesting after bishop e2. If black were to go for e6, of course, now it will be again a little bit different, because now we don't have the bishop on d3. But the system I'm recommending is d takes c5, and now we're already asking black a question: how do you want to regain that pawn on c5? And there's only one good way to do that for him, is to go e6 and then try to recapture the pawn with the bishop. If he goes for queen a5 check, he's just moving his queen out in the center for no reason at all, basically losing 2 tempos here. After knight d2, queen c5, c4, e6, a3, white will have very easy play with b4, followed by bishop b2 and rook c1 next. And yeah, white is just a little bit better here. So e6 is the move, and now b4 is the most challenging move here. Again, white could go for something like a3 and bishop c5, b4, bishop b2, for example, something like this, and then c4. But here, usually black is fine because he has adequate counterplay with a5, and after b5, he gets this square on c5 for the knight, and black is pretty okay here. So the idea is b4, and now black has to act fast, otherwise he's simply a pawn down. A5 is the best move. b6 immediately, also one typical idea, but now after c takes b6, bishop takes b4 check, white can go c3, and after ba7, rook a7. Black does have some compensation, but still white is a pawn up, and black will have to defend here in this position. So a5 is the best move, now c3. And now the best for black is to go a takes b4, c takes b4, and now b6. So black has to basically know all of these moves or find them over the board, this sequence, otherwise he's under some pressure already. For example, knight c6 might also look logical, attacking the pawn on b4, but now after bishop b5 he will actually have a hard time regaining that pawn due to the pin, and white is already much better here. So a takes b4, c takes b4, b6, and now the point is after c b6, bishop takes b4 check, and black will regain the pawn on b6 on the next move, because now there's no more c3 as we saw earlier. So after b6, bishop b5 check is the move, bishop d7 the only move. If you were to block that with the knight, for example, then c6, and white is already winning, because if he moves the knight, then c7 is just winning the queen. So bishop d7 is best, bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, a4, important move, b takes c5, and now b5, and this is kind of like the starting position of this line. And if some of you are familiar with the Note-Boom system, this is quite a similar structure here, where white has these connected outside pass pawns, and black has this central pawn mass. In general, I always felt like this is easier to play in this case for white, because white only needs one more piece to prepare a5 basically, and these pawns in the center for black are not as mobile. He will need a lot of time to actually start moving these pawns, while white's pawns seem to be a bit more mobile in this case. For example, bishop d6, bishop b2, short castle and short castle, and white will continue with knight d2, queen c2, and then in some cases white can try to play in the center himself with e4, and of course there are ideas as well to try and advance the pawns on the queen side as well. So this is important after c5, that we cannot go into our Zukertort system, but here after c5 we have to take, or bishop e2, as I mentioned, is another more solid alternative. Instead of c5, we discussed g6 in the last episode, when after g6 my recommendation was knight bd2. So with this move order against d5, e3, g6, white could go b3, which would most likely transpose to one of the lines which I gave in the previous part. Another suggestion would be to go c4, when now after bishop g7 black doesn't get this typical Grunfeld, because the knight is not on c3 already. And white can take here, and after knight takes d4, d5, e4, black doesn't have the option to capture on c3. This is quite a typical idea. Even though white gives this tempo here with the e-pawn, it's still quite a nice version for white, because black simply doesn't have the option to take on c3. And after something like knight b6, knight c3, white has this nice center. So g6 here, most players wouldn't go for this. Instead, now let's focus on the bishop moves. For example, bishop f5 or bishop g4. Let's start with bishop f5. Here, black basically is ready to go for the Slav. After c4, c6, we will be in one of the main lines in the Slav. But here, I recommend the move bishop d3, which I think is quite interesting. And we are basically avoiding all of the theory here. And white, in most cases, still keeps some advantage, or better to say some easier play in most cases. I also played that system in the World Rapid Championship against Robbie Kavlashvili, and here he went for the move e6. And now it allows white to take on f5, e takes f5, and now this important idea with queen d3. White is attacking the pawn on f5, and at the same time there's the threat of queen b5 check. For example, if black were to protected pawn on f5 with g6, then queen b5 check would win the pawn on b7. So Robbie in our game went queen c8. This is a strong move, and after short castle he went bishop d6. And here basically the only thing you have to know is you go b3, and this is also what I played in the game, and you're preparing c4 on the next move. If you would go c4 right away, it would give black the option to take, and now you have to take with the queen, and then black has this nice square on d5 for one of his knights later on, for example, after c6. So b3 kind of prepares all of this, and after castle c4, here Robbie even took on c4 anyway, and now I got the move b takes c4, and of course I prefer to take here with the pawn instead of the queen. And after rook e8, bishop a3 in our game, position was roughly balanced, but I was able to get a small advantage later on. Game still ended in a draw, but I think this is something white can be fairly happy with. Instead of e6, black could also take on d3 or go bishop g6. Let's start with bishop takes d3. Now queen takes d3, and again we have the same threat with queen b5 check. For example, e6 looks quite logical, but now after queen b5 check, white is simply winning a pawn. Instead, c6 would be better than e6, and now after c4, e6, knight c3, white has this very nice plan of castling short and then going e4. Instead of knight c3, knight e2 would also be an option with the same plan of pushing e4 later on. Let's have a look at one example line. After knight c3, bishop e7, short castle, and now e4, and black has to do something in the center here. Arguably the better capture is d takes e4, because after d takes c4, queen takes e4, white keeps this very nice central advantage and has a very decent position here with moves like bishop f4, rook c1, and rook d1 to follow. So d takes e4 would be the preferred recapture here. Knight takes e4, queen takes e4, for example, knight d7 and bishop f4. And after knight f6, queen e2, white has a very nice position. Not a big advantage at all, but white does have more space here. Has this nice square on e5 for his knight, and another idea could be rook d1 followed by rook d3 later on, in combination with knight e5. And in general, white will try to play for a kingside attack later on, for example, with rook g3 or rook h3 in connection. Black usually here will try to look for some counterplay on the queen side. With, for example, a5 and a4. So usually white doesn't really want to touch any pawns on the queen side here, not to create any extra weaknesses for black to attack. So I still think this position is quite pleasant for white, just because of this nice space advantage, and black doesn't have that many squares for his pieces. And something similar can happen also if black goes bishop g6. Now we go c4, e6, short castle, and now after something like c6, the move queen c2 strikes me as being a very nice plan with somewhat of a similar idea. After knight bd7, we go knight bd2, and again we want to prepare e4. Here knight bd2 is quite important because knight c3 doesn't work due to d takes c4, and now we cannot take back the pawn on c4 because our queen on c2 is hanging. So that therefore knight bd2 is a much better square for the knight. For example, bishop e7, and now we could go for e4 right away, which might even transpose if black were to take everything, but also an interesting option is to take on g6 first, and after hg6 now to go e4, when we have a very similar position to earlier, but these doubled pawns could also become a weakness later on for black, because now we can put one of our minor pieces to g5 on g5. And black cannot kick them out anymore with move h6. Apart from that, the plans stay pretty much the same in this position as earlier. So yeah, this is about bishop g4, about bishop f5, everything I wanted to say. Now let's move on to bishop g4. And here it's important to kind of counter immediately on the queen side. So you can remember whenever black goes bishop g4, it does somewhat weaken the pawn on b7. The same can also be applied to bishop f5. But after bishop g4, the issue is even more prevalent because after c4, c6, the move I recommend is queen b3. And now the idea with queen b3 is, of course, first of all, attacking the pawn on b7. Second idea is to go out of this pin with the knight on f3 and the queen on d1. And now often we even have the idea with knight e5 to gain a tempo on the bishop and to activate our knight at the same time. So this plan with queen b3 is extra powerful if black puts the bishop on g4. Now after queen b3, white usually doesn't have to worry that black would take here, since after g takes f3, white does have the double pawns, but he has this very nice light squared bishop here. For example, after g takes f3, queen b6, knight c3. White could later on think about breaking with e4 in the center, but also a position like this after e6, for example, c5, queen takes b3, a takes b3, usually is very nice because of the central advantage. And if black is not in time to push e5 in any cases, then white will just have a free hand, for example, on the queen side with b4, b5, and just to strengthen the center with f4. So this is important here after bishop g4 to immediately strike with c4 and then to go queen b3, followed by knight e5. Now let's move on to the most important line, which is e6. Now I should also mention that immediately e6 we can also answer with e3, and now in most cases it will transpose to some lines which we will see now. So after d5, e3, just let's move to e6. And now when black makes this move e6, now he kind of made his plans clear that the bishop on c8 will not go out anymore, but that he will in most cases go for the fianchetto on the queen side. And here after e6 we can go for the Zuckertort system with bishop d3. Another move order is to start with b3. In most cases it doesn't matter. With this move order, white even has the chance sometimes to take on c5 right away, for example here, and then again to move for this plan with b4 followed by c4. But yeah, these are just some extra options basically. So bishop d3, and now what is mostly played is that black goes c5, and now black is kind of threatening to go c4 in some cases. For example, after short castle, c4 would be an idea because now the bishop has to go back to e2 and white wants to push e4, but with the bishop on e2 this will be quite hard to achieve. So after c5 it's quite important to go b3 to stop this idea with c4. And after, for example, knight c6, bishop b2, bishop d6, short castle, knight bd2. This is a type of position which you can get quite often in the Zuckertort. And here it's important to really discuss what are the plans, since this position can be reached quite often. So black in most cases should go for this queenside fianchetto. Also some players make this, I would even call it a mistake of taking on d4. Why is it a mistake? Because the tension in the center mostly favors black in general, because even here, in some cases, he even has the idea of pushing c4, of course, in connection with some tactics. For example, if the bishop is already in b7, then after c4, b takes c4, d takes c4, this diagonal would open up. Usually it doesn't work, but it is at least one extra option for black. And the more pressing issue after cd4, ed4 is that the e line opens up. I think this is kind of the main reason why black doesn't want to take here. And after, for example, queen e2 followed, then white has extra control of the e5 square, because the queen would protect the knight here. So in general, what white wants to do here is to put this knight on e5. This is kind of the main idea here. And then often to continue the attack with f4 to strengthen the knight on e5. And then to either put the queen to h3 or even the rook lift to h3, when often black has issues with the pawn on h7. For example, b6, and in general, it's not necessary yet, but I would recommend to go a3 as soon as possible here, just not to run into any ideas with knight b4. Let's say white doesn't go a3 yet, but goes knight e5 first, bishop b7, f4, rook c8. And now let's just make a move like king h1. Just I want to illustrate the plan. Now knight b4 would be quite an issue, because white really doesn't want to give up this bishop on d3, since it's kind of the most active piece in white's position. And now after knight b4, the bishop cannot move, because after cd4, if white recaptures, then the pawn on c2 is hanging and black could take. So kind of whenever this constellation knight c6 and rook c8 is on the board, now it's really time to go a3 to stop this idea with knight b4. But as I said, you can already do it earlier just to completely stop worrying about the ideas with knight b4. And this is a type of position which you can get, rook c8, and now white can also wait with this move f4, for example, with a move like queen e2. But in general, what you want is to go for a plan like this. And now, as I said earlier, white in general wants to play for a kingside attack here, mostly involving this point on h7. You can do that, as I said, with queen f3 followed by queen h3, or also with the plan of rook f3 followed by rook h3. Another idea is, especially if black goes h6 sooner or later, to really open up the kingside with g4 followed by g5, and really to start a kingside attack there as well. Also, one thing I should mention is that in general, white doesn't really want to take on c5 that often, but often it's a concrete idea, because now after dc5, white does give up control of the center, specifically the square on e5, a little bit. And it also gives black the chance to either capture with the bishop or the pawn. With the bishop now, for example, the pawn on e3 is also a weakness. But what I really want to stress here is that d takes e5 often works just concretely because it activates the bishop on b2, and often there are some sacrifices on h7 or on g7, for example. One common idea is, let's just say after f4, let's say black has this position here, and one common idea often would be, okay, let's put it on the board like this, for example. One common idea is often to open up everything here, and then now we see, for example, in a position like this, that these bishops really start to become quite strong, especially with the rook on g3 or rook on h3. This attack could become very powerful, as you see here. So I just wanted to also mention this idea, which, as I said, has to work out concretely. Otherwise, this capture would only favor black because the pawn on e3 becomes quite weak. Another variation I wanted to mention was this game I saw. It was between Esipenko and Arutinian, an online game, where black put the knight to d7, which I think is even a bit more inaccurate than the move knight c6. Because with the knight on c6, he has this idea of going knight b4 later on. And another idea, which I didn't even mention, was that in a position like this, for example, what black should go for is this idea with knight d7. So this is kind of black's best reply here, because it opens up the bishop on b7, and it kind of makes knight e4 sort of ready to block this bishop in on d3. For example, now after rook f3, knight e4 would work, and now obviously white would like to take with the knight here on e4, but cannot, because now there's this double attack here. So this is kind of black's best idea, and that was also the reason why I think that knight bd7 is kind of not the best square, because also black doesn't have this regrouping with knight e7 later on. I just briefly want to mention this game: knight d2, bishop d6, knight e5, castle, queen e2, queen c7, and white played f4, and here black played knight e4. And kind of the reaction you want here is to take on e4 with the knight, as it was played in the game, d takes e4 and bishop c4. And now black has these doubled pawns, which often even in an endgame can be quite an issue. For example, if you look at a structure like this, and imagine that all the minor pieces are gone, and queens and rooks, white will have this this pawn advantage on the queen side, and will in some cases have the option to make an outside passed pawn. But of course here there are still many pieces on the board, but still this bishop on c4 is sometimes quite powerful, especially in connection with sacrifices on f7. Also, I think in the game something like f5 happened, which immediately opens up the diagonal for the bishop, and still this bishop on b2 is kind of like a sleeping monster, I would even call it, because whenever d takes c5 happens, this bishop on b2 can become quite powerful. In general, this is something I would like to say again. The bishop on b2 often looks quite passive here, but it is a very important piece overall, because it does protect the pawn on d4 in many cases, and often if this bishop opens up, then it will become quite powerful. One last line which I want to say here is after bishop in this move order here. The move order I said with b3 is totally playable, and now after bishop b2 we would be back in our variation with knight e5. But one more positional approach, which I played myself sometimes, is to go for this move c4, still with the bishop being on c1. And the point is, after bishop e7, now white wants to go for this cowspot structure and exchange this bishop here with bishop a3. And I played this a couple of times myself with the white pieces, and I think this is also quite a nice position. For example, if black takes on a3, knight takes a3, queen e7, knight b5, the knight goes back to c3, a6, knight c3, and a position like this usually plays from itself, because black is kind of stuck with this weak pawn on c7. So I think that was everything I wanted to say. I hope you guys enjoyed part 2 of this series. There should be one more part coming, and definitely comment in the just shoot a comment down below which variations you would still like to see. For example, in the last part, I would briefly like to discuss the Dutch defense and other sidelines. But definitely let me know which of those sidelines would be interesting for you, and which move orders or which lines I should maybe have like a closer look. So let me know, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and my voice is slowly going away, so now it's time to call it a day. And as I said, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.